p.m. Eastern Time, and welcome everybody to the second session of the online consortium of the Research Methods Division and Karma Doctoral and Junior Faculty Consortium. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time today, my name is Thomas Greckhammer, and I'm the CSG of the Research Methods Division Karma Consortium. And I'm welcoming you on behalf of the entire committee, Jose Cortina, Timothy Quigley, and Raza Mir, and our student representatives from the Research Methods Division, Nitya Chavla, Elizabeth Clayton, Yifan Song, and Ki Sang. And today we are having an exception to our regular scheduling. Usually the other sessions are being held from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And today we are having from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time because this way we fit nicely into the ongoing Karma short courses at Wayne State University in Detroit. So we send out a big hello as well to Wayne State University. Today's topic is new methods in management research. And I believe you will see that we have a really exciting lineup here of topics and of speakers. And I would like to welcome Timothy Hubbard from Notre Dame University, who will speak to us about structural equation modeling for macro research. And the next panelist then will be Kate Keeler from Virginia Commonwealth University, who will speak about restricted variance interactions. And last but not least, our third panelist will be Katherine Chen from CUNY, actually from the sociology department in CUNY, and we will hear from her about conducting field-level qualitative research, new approaches to understanding organizations and their relations. In terms of the, just a few words in terms of the schedule and the program we'll do. Without further ado, we'll turn to our first presenter, Tim Hubbard. Each of the panelists will have 30 minutes, so they will have an introductory presentation of about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have an open questions and answers online discussion, and I will jump in here to moderate them and help the panelists navigating the discussion. And then we'll turn through to each of the panelists in turn. So Tim, thank you very much again, and the floor is all yours.
Okay, let me share my screen so I can get the presentation going. And if you have trouble hearing me or something, just write in the chat, and I've got it open here, so hopefully I can see that. So share screen, and then I will make this a little bit larger. Okay, so thank you all for having me. This is an exciting consortium. I did this, I think it was the first year that it was offered, and I learned so much, and so it's a real honor to be back talking to you guys as a panelist here. The topic for today is structural equation modeling and strategic management. And you know, the overall topic, when it said new methods in strategic management, structural equation modeling is not a new method by any means, but we don't see it as much yet in strategic management in the literature yet. Typically, I find that there are two people in strategic management: those that have no idea what structural equation modeling is, and those that probably had one class about SEM in their PhD program. They passed the class and that was about it. So they might feel comfortable, you know, reading about the methods and things like that, but might not be applying it currently in their own research. And so hopefully this presentation has kind of two focuses then. One is a little bit of an introduction so that you feel comfortable when you look at SEM models or you want to try running a few things. It's a lot easier to do that these days than it used to be. And the other is to show a few examples that are a little bit more complicated, but those are for the people that know the basics of SEM, but might be wondering exactly how can we apply this to strategic management, because there's some specific and more interesting techniques that we can look at there. So as I get started, I need to move something from my screen, but I can't seem to. So just want to kind of lay out that SEM is not a exact particular method. It's a family of methods. And so it's not just one size fits all. It's not ordinary least squares regression where you go into Stata, you type reg, and you get a result out. SEM is very big. It's very diverse. It can handle a lot of different types of data, different types of analyses, and so don't get stuck into the idea of thinking that SEM is just one particular thing. SEM covers a broad range of topics, and each one of them can be used separately and differently in order to test new and interesting theory. And so that's kind of the first takeaway. If we stand back and we look at what is structural equation modeling, it is a very general and very powerful multivariate technique. And so that's critical. It's not ordinary least squares regression or panel regression where you have one dependent variable. In this case, you can have multiple independent variables, dependent variables, mediators, moderators, all going on in the same model. So the same analyses, when you get out the results, you've got one core set of results that then encompass a number of different pathways, a number of different measurement models, and things like that, so that you get an overall big picture of what it is that is happening in your data with the theory that you're proposing and you're testing. A few, three examples of applications. The first is confirmatory factor analysis. This is one we see a lot on the macro side. So you're developing a new scale and you want to see, does that scale accurately represent a latent construct? So if you're studying CEO power, for example, you might find a number of indicators that would indicate CEO power, and you could use confirmatory factor analysis to be able to provide statistical evidence that this is a valid measure. And if you're using latent variables in your model, this is typically a good place to start in the analysis. And we'll kind of go through some of the basic steps for analysis here in a little bit. The next step, or the next example, is causal modeling. And I put in parentheses or path analysis because causal modeling sounds like we're approaching causality, which is always a dangerous thing to talk about in science. And so I much prefer path analysis. It's really where we're looking at relationships between either observed and latent variables or latent variables and latent variables. And so we're looking at relationships between these variables as opposed to confirmatory factor analysis where we're trying to say this measure is valid, this measure isn't valid. And so, but you'll see a lot of times in papers and in books them talk about causal modeling. And in a second, we'll show you an example, but think of that as path analysis, okay? And then latent growth modeling, I'll talk about on the 9th slide. It is really looking at trajectories and changes in variables over time, which is so important to strategic management literature. This is the type of thing where we can say that a change in this variable over time leads to a change in that variable over time. And that's an extremely powerful concept. And we're not currently using latent growth modeling, at least from what I've seen in strategic management literature, as much as we could or we should. So that's why I want to highlight that one when we get a little bit further into the presentation. So if we look at key features of SEM, a key feature, one of the most important, I think, is that it can handle both latent and observed variables. So a latent variable is something that you can't necessarily measure directly. So for example, positive affect. How positive do I feel at the current moment is really hard to kind of nail down and say, okay, here's one measure that we can observe that's going to indicate how happy Tim is at the current moment. I'm extremely happy, as you can tell. But instead, we measure PANIS, for example, positive and negative affect. We'll measure a number of different variables, and then we'll see if those variables hold together and then represent happiness for an individual, for example, myself. And so we can take care of that in structural equation modeling. We can take care of it actually in a way where we don't have to collapse it into a single measure that throws away all of the measurement error that we would do if we, for example, just took an average of those values. Instead, in SEM, we can have all of those independent indicators in there and recognize that they aren't perfect, and the overall measure isn't going to be perfect. That error can be accounted for explicitly in SEM. One of the second one here, one of the most important things with SEM is that you can have multiple independent, dependent, mediator, moderator variables, control variables, all in the same model. So you don't have to run separate regressions to look at different parts of the model. In SEM, you can really package it all together, run a model, assess the overall fit, which is the next one, and then be able to test hypotheses after you know you have a good model, but it's all in one place, which is really nice. The third one, which I just hinted at, is model fit. So we can look at an overall model, and I'll show an example or two in a little bit, and we can say this model is appropriate for this data. And we can test that, and we can show, before we even get into testing hypotheses, does the theory that we laid out in that path model, in that confirmatory factor analysis, does that hold at all? And that's a great step to test before even getting into hypothesis testing. Flexible assumptions, this is one where, if variables are correlated with each other, we can be explicit about that. If we expect them not to be, we can be explicit about that. And so much like, for example, Bayesian modeling, where you have to be very explicit in how you're laying things out, that's a feature of SEM as well, where you have to make a number of choices, and based on those choices, then that impacts the overall model, hypothesis testing, and everything. And so those flexible assumptions then allow you to be very explicit about the assumptions in your models. You can use confirmatory factor analysis to account for measurement error explicitly in your models, which is extremely important. We don't throw, in my opinion, we don't throw as much information away in SEM as we might in, for example, aggregating a number of indicators into a single variable and then using that in a regression. A lot of information is lost in that process. We don't do that in SEM. The next one is straightforward test of mediation, moderated mediation. This is a critical thing in strategy. We don't, in my opinion, do enough tests of mediation to explain our theory. We'll go big steps. We'll go, CEO power to firm risk taking, but we won't necessarily go and explain what are the individual parts that lead to those differences. We might do some separate regressions or a supplemental analysis to get in those things. But SEM is one of those where we can actually go in and test for direct, indirect effects, total effects, which is very powerful. Next one, we can do multi-level modeling, non-normal variables. These things used to be much more complicated, even just a few years ago, but software packages have been getting much better at making it easier for people to go in and use these. They used to feel like more complicated techniques, but lately they haven't felt like that because they are integrated into the packages so well. And so it again allows for understanding the data, using the data explicitly, and then working with the assumptions. And then finally, a lot of times in our models, we just hope that things aren't correlated, independent variables aren't correlated with each other and things like that. In SEM, you can correlate them, and you can look at the correlations and how that impacts various parts of the model. And so again, it allows you to be explicit about that in your modeling. One thing that I have to say that is so important in SEM is the role of theory. And theory, we know it's so critical in management research, and we preach that and we practice that. But in SEM, it's exceptionally important, because if you don't have a good model and the model fit statistics aren't showing promise, you really aren't going to be able to test hypotheses in the way that you would like. And so there isn't, if you have a poorly fitting model, it's not something that you can then go and draw conclusions from. And so there is that necessary theory ahead of time to be able to make sure that you're going to get results and things that you can use after you collect the data. And there's generally 3 buckets of ways to approach theory in SEM. The first is strictly confirmatory. And so in your theory, before you collect data, you lay out, here's the model that I'm planning. You can see, I think I'm sharing my screen. You can see I do this all the time. So I've got it laid out there. I haven't collected any of the data on it. And when I get done, I'm going to run that specific model and see if it fits the data. At other times, you could have alternative models being proposed. You might have 2 or 3, and then you have fit statistics and things like that that allow you to compare different models and to select the best model. But again, you should be doing these a priori, so not after the fact. And then the last one is model generation. So you might then go back and look after you've tried your model, it didn't work, let's say. You might go and try to figure out why and what you can do differently. And model generation, sometimes exploratory structural equation modeling, you can use those types of things. But in general, most of the application is really going to be between strictly confirmatory and alternative models. So just keep that in mind, that theory is so critical here. There's a bunch of symbols and notations. This is kind of that beginning stuff for people that aren't aware of it. If you go to a conference presentation, specifically on the OB side, and they put up a model, you might see these types of shapes. Oval is always a latent variable. So again, it's a variable that isn't directly measured, but it's measured through indicators. And those are marked as rectangles. So those are observed variables. Direct effects are single lines going through. A lot of times when you look at a paper, if you see a dashed line going from one construct to the other or one measure to the other, that typically means that the path wasn't statistically significant. But when you're laying out your models, just simple lines. And then lines going back and forth, you can actually have and explicitly model reciprocal effects. So let's say you have the happiness of a wife and happiness of a husband. A lot of times those are reciprocally effects. So if one's happier, the other's happier, and if one's upset, the other's upset. And so in SEM, you can explicitly model that. And then correlations and covariances, you'll see that double-headed arrow going between either latent variables. Sometimes they'll be drawn between the error terms, which I don't go through here, but that's the type of thing to say, yes, I acknowledge explicitly that these two latent variables, observed variables, they are related to each other. And then my PowerPoint froze. How do I get that back going? Let me try again here. Sorry about that. There we go. So if we look at this as an example, we can see that CEO power is a latent variable. We can't directly measure CEO power as much as we'd like to, but we do have a number of indicators that could represent CEO power. And so we could measure those and then use structural equation modeling to calculate a higher level latent variable, CEO power, and then look at that effect on, for example, firm risk, which we, in this case as an example, was something that we observed directly. And so this is a way that you can see all of these parts come together. For example, CEO duality and overpayment might be related, so we explicitly model that. Same with overpayment and tenure, and duality and tenure. We explicitly say that these things can co-vary with each other, and they all represent CEO power, which we don't measure directly. And all of the measurement error and everything is accounted for in the model, and then that predicts firm risk. So that's when you see a model like that, hopefully now you can get a little bit better idea how to read it very quickly. So a number of steps to kind of go through this. I'm going to run through these kind of quick. Like, we're going to post the slides, so you can always come back and pick these up. But it is important to kind of go through these because it gives a really good understanding of how this works. So like I said earlier, define theoretically motivated model before collecting data. If you're going to do alternative models, specify those up front so that you don't have to go back and collect data again. It's faux pas. But go ahead and define a model, draw it out. You can see it on my whiteboard. I do this all the time. The next step, collect, clean, and prepare the data. Consider using multiple indicators for latent variables. So if you have something like CEO power, collect a number of variables and then have a latent factor in there, and be able to use that in a way that then is powerful in the model. Run the model in SEM software. Most of us use Stata these days. R has packages for SEM. M+ is fantastic, but in the beginning, I would try with Stata. It'll get you started. I've put some example code at the back that we can look at, but it's one way to get your feet wet, understand what the output looks like, understand what the input looks like, test a few models, get your feet wet. If you're going to do something more complex, I really recommend moving into M+. M+ is what I learned first. It's extremely powerful. It's extremely well supported. If you have questions or models aren't running, they will help you out and get those things running. And so the support structure there is fantastic. You're typically going to do the work in two steps. You're going to first assess the measurement of latent variables, and there you're going to see, do these measures hold? Does this make sense for me to include in a path model? Or are the measures messed up enough that I shouldn't even approach a path model because we're not going to get a good result? And so that's why I say first measurement, then structural. And structural is where we're looking at hypothesized relationships and things like that, so relationships between variables. The fourth step, which is so important and somewhat different, if we run a ordinary least squares regression, we might report the R-squared in the table, but we're not going actually as deep into it as we should. With SEM, it's so critical to take these overall fit statistics and look at whether or not the model reasonably fits the data. And if it doesn't, you got to go back and you got to fix that before you can really dive into something more detailed. There are a pile of fit statistics. If you run Stata's fit statistics, you'll probably get 12 to 13 fit statistics out. I've put here the 4 that I recommend, and Klein in his book recommends, and I've got the link to that at the back. These are 4 that kind of cover the gamut. Some do some parts of fit better than others. So overall fit statistics, relative fit statistics, comparative. If you do these 4 and you report these 4, you should feel pretty good that you've got a model. And reviewers should look at those and feel comfortable that you've provided a baseline level of information. You should always report more, but at a minimum, those are a good one to start at. And if you need help working through these at any time, never hesitate to email or call me. I'm always happy to help. For hypothesis testing, then that's the last step. So you've kind of had to go through all of this stuff, even to get to the fun stuff. But you can test for direct effects, indirect effects. So that's through another variable. Does this impact a dependent variable through another variable? And total effects. So you can then combine and look at, does it overall have an effect? And you can easily extend this to moderated mediation, more complicated methods. There's no problem in doing that, and it's not as daunting as it initially seems. I don't know how somebody drew on my screen. Okay. I don't know how to get those blue lines. Do you guys? Well, doesn't matter if you see it. I'm going to keep going. So confirmatory factor analysis is really, I put it in here, it's heavily used on the micro side, but on the macro side, if you're going to have latent variables, go through it, and before you assess the overall model, do check that the measures that you set up in the beginning are actually valid. And so you'll run a model like this, you'll look at the loadings of these indicators on that latent variable. You want to make sure they're all in the right direction. You'll look at the fit statistics to make sure that the fit is good for the overall model. You can include multiple different measures and look, do they load with measures they should load? Do they not load with measures that they shouldn't? And all of those things then you can report so reviewers feel more comfortable with the fact that you're measuring things the way you should be for these latent variables. Mediation is another key thing. We don't use it as much in strategy, and it pains me. But it is so important for science, for us to really push theories forward. And it moves us beyond just testing that direct relationship. Using XT-reg, and we get out a result with fixed effects, and then we say, yep, that's it. But we don't necessarily say, for example, in this horrible example at the bottom, that Slack leads to profitability through research and development. We might measure Slack to return on assets. This, of course, is not making any sense, but it's an example I put together. But what we can do with mediation is we can say, no, you know what, Slack leads to research and research and development leads to profitability. And we can then look at the direct effect with that line, which I put the subscript A on. We can look at the indirect effects, so that's the effect that is mediated through research and development. So that's B times C is a common notation. And then the total effect, which is what we might get if we ignored the research and development and just looked at Slack to ROA, is then the combination of the two. And the software makes it very easy for you to run those calculations after you've got the model fits and everything run. So that's extremely powerful for us to be able to use. Now, onto a little bit more of a complicated topic is latent growth modeling. And the reason I've decided to come to latent growth modeling is that it's very important for strategic management. It allows us to look at things over time. So for example, if we have strategic change over time, you can imagine each one of these as a firm, and we have a amount of variance in the intercepts, we have an amount of variance in the slopes, and what latent growth modeling allows us to do is look at what are the differences in there and how can we use them. I'm going to just do this because it keeps locking up on me, this slide. And how can we use those? Then we can model the the initial state, or the intercept. We can model a slope, and then we can use something, look at the change in that slope with the change in another variable. And this is extremely powerful. We're not just saying that high levels of this variable lead to high levels in this variable. We're saying if you increase the level of strategic change, you increase the performance, the change in performance. So that's just something to consider. File in the back of your mind if you're ever looking at longitudinal data and you want to look at what's the change in this variable leading to the change in that variable. Just file in the back of your mind that latent growth modeling is one way that you can do it. Looking at the time, I'm going to go ahead and skip growth mixture modeling, but it's in the slides if you need it. And then I do want to get here real quick and just show some quick sample code for Stata. It's an easy way to get started. As you can see, the notation is very simple. It's, you basically, you're just drawing arrows in the code based on how you want the model to look like. And then it's easy, one line command to get all the fit statistics and one line command to get the direct, indirect, and total effects. So it's very, very easy, very straightforward. And so take this code, pull up a data set, CompuStat something, run a few things so you feel comfortable, and give it a try. And then I put 3 books in the back, and then 3 websites that I thought were beneficial. And this presentation is going on Dropbox, so this is one of those where you can go there, you can look at it. And I know we're at the end of my time almost, so don't hesitate to email me questions and things like that. But I'm going to take a few questions if possible.
Tim, thank you very much for this excellent presentation, and we can take a number of questions now through. If you have questions, just use the chat function, please, and submit your questions to Tim.
Sorry for going over. I apologize. Well, as we wait for a question to come in, growth mixture modeling. Oh, can I speak? Applied to longitudinal studies. Absolutely. So longitudinal studies, the best way that I would approach those is through latent growth modeling, where you would then explicitly model, here's a number of indicators going across time, and then the software can allow you to look at the mean of that, and then you can look at variance in those and whether or not those changes in that variable over time can then impact other variables over time as well. It's extremely powerful. Bolin and Kieran have a great book on latent curve modeling, and so it's a great way to get started. If you get into that way, definitely drop me an email. I'm more than happy to help. What covariates would be important for latent growth modeling in strategic management? Just about anything. So one of the nice things with latent growth modeling is that you can have a set of variables that impact both the initial status and the slope of a variable. And so you can imagine different trajectories. You can have a set of variables that impact that in the beginning. And that's a great way to include a set of control variables that you think are going to kind of kickstart and explain how is it that this process starts and how is it that it affects. So you could have, for example, firm size leading to those, and that would be one way to include that. Does SEM require knowledge of matrix algebra? No, not anymore. If you get into the details of it, if you're interested in, for example, the details of fit statistics, things can get rather complicated. But lately with SEM, for example, in Stata, I mean, those couple of lines of code there, the 3 lines of code that I gave, are enough to get you started, and there's nothing more behind it. But the book that I have, the first one that's listed in there is from Klein. It's an updated version from what I used a long time ago, and it's fantastic to get you started. So Klein 2016, the 3rd edition is really great. Are there methods to test fit?
So Tim, if you could, there's the question, what are some good ways to articulate the rationale behind model generation? I think that would be a really interesting question to dive back to your earlier points on model building.
Right. So what are some good ways to articulate the rationale between model generation or exploratory SEM? Initial hypotheses don't hold. So model generation and exploratory SEM, they're if you take exploratory SEM, it's kind of its own method that's a bit more advanced. But model generation, there's a way that you can run your model and get your fit statistics. If it doesn't work out, you can look at what are called modification indices. And modification indices look at the paths that you don't have. If they were there, how much better would your model fit? This is commonly frowned upon because it's a way, for example, of cheating almost, because you can run your initial model, it doesn't work, you look at the modification indices and you go, all right, I'm going to add a path here and a path here and a path there. And that's a way of, yeah, I look at it as cheating. But at the same time, if you're developing a model or adjusting a model, it's a really good way to see what are the paths that I didn't think about? What are the covariances that I should have included that I didn't? And it's a really good way. It's extremely easy in Stata to do. It's just M indices is the command. And so it's one way to step beyond what you initially ran. Given it's 2:30,
no, I think we can do one or two, depending on how long you take for the answer. Are there any methods to test the fit of model of GSEM?
So GSEM, typically you're going to get out an SRMR, standardized root mean error, and that's one that typically comes out with GSEM. And so you'll get one or two fit statistics, but you're not going to get the same in-depth amount of fit statistics that you would if you used the standard SEM command in Stata. But it gives you a point to run from. And the other thing you can always do, typically using GSEM for multi-level models or non-continuous dependent variables, you can always rerun it as an SEM and just look at the fit statistics so that you feel good about what you're doing. But reporting it, yeah, you're typically only going to have one or two fit statistics to be able to report. So it's a little bit more challenging in GSEM.
And perhaps as the last question, a brief answer to the relationship of error terms in different equations.
The biggest challenge for SEM is to define a relationship of error terms. Do you have suggestions about reading your software packages? Yeah, the Klein book has really good discussion on measurement error. And there's also a book that I can find. Email me, and there's another book that has a great chapter or two on that. But yeah, understanding the error terms is really important. And yeah, I think they're really starting to be explicit about which ones are correlated, why are they correlated, and then using model fit statistics that account for parsimony. So some of them allow you to look and see it, like if you have a more complicated model, it actually penalizes you. And so you have to find that nice balance between parsimony and complexity. And so that's one way to look at it as well.
Well, Tim, thank you very much again for this very informative presentation. There are a few more questions here in the chat. We're out of time, but if you might consider providing a brief answer, maybe in the chat, if you would be so kind.
Yeah.
And to everybody again, as Tim noted, we will place his presentation along with the other presentations into our Dropbox folder. And in the interest of time, I would like us to move on now to our second panelist, to Kate Keeler from Virginia Commonwealth University, speaking about restricted variance interactions. And again, she will start us off with a presentation, and then we will open the floor to your questions as well.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm a doctoral student at Virginia Commonwealth. I work with Jose Cortina, and what I will be talking about is a project we've been working on for a few years now. Specifically, oops, hold on. Stop sharing. Let's try this again. Okay, specifically restricted variance interactions, what they are and why you should be using them in your research. So many have highlighted the lack of justification for proposed interaction effects. And this also coincides with the fact that many interaction effects are very small. And it could be that these two things are somewhat related. We don't really understand the nature of the interaction, and so we're not really testing it in the right way, or we're not using the right variables. And so we're finding these small interaction effects. And it's not that arguments are difficult for interaction effects. In fact, they're really simple when the moderator is truly categorical. For instance, does the XY relationship, is it different for the treatment versus control group? But it is harder to make arguments for a gradual change in a slope as a function of the moderator, so when the moderator is continuous. But the type of interaction that I'm going to be discussing today is actually easy to justify, regardless whether the moderator is categorical or continuous. And this goes back to Walter Mischel's work. So Walter Mischel, he looked at the personality literature and specifically its relationship with behavior. And he argued that personality and situations interact to predict behavior. And specifically, when the situation is clear and it has well-defined norms for behavior, what we call now a strong situation, variability in behavior is limited. And therefore, it has very little covariance with personality. But in weak situations, situations that are more ambiguous, where there aren't these clear norms, behavior has more variance. We see greater variability. And this variance can be explained with personality. This, in a nutshell, is what we call the restricted variance or RV interaction. It's that the variance of X or Y is compressed as a function of Z, and it's this compression of variance that affects the XY relationship. So this type of interaction is demonstrated by this very common example. So what is the relationship between conscientiousness and driving behavior when approaching a traffic light? Well, it depends. Is it a red light or is it a green light? Well, here, in either case, the behavioral norms are very clear. You stop when there's a red light and you go through the intersection when there's a green light. In this case, your level of conscientiousness doesn't matter. It isn't explaining anything in your behavior. But what about a yellow light? Here, the behavioral norms are more ambiguous. So some people might stop, other people might speed on through the intersection. In this case, conscientiousness is likely to influence whether or not you speed up or you stop. RV interactions have largely been limited to social psychology, but Cortina and colleagues have shown that these types of interaction effects are very common at all levels of analysis. One reason why these interactions are so common is because they're very simple to defend. You simply need to make the argument that under certain conditions, the variance in one variable is compressed, which affects its covariance with other variables in the model. Under other conditions, the variance of the variable is not compressed. And in this case, it can covary with the other variables. So to give you a sense of how common these interactions are, here are a few examples. So Liu et al. Is a great example of RV phenomenon in a macro level. They hypothesized that firm international experience is predictive of foreign direct investment. But this is moderated by the presence of market-supporting institutions. Specifically, in countries with strong market-supporting institutions, prior international experience is less important in determining FDI, rather as opposed to in countries with weak market-supporting institutions. And the reason, their rationale for this is that strong markets supporting institutions help firms to identify and contact potential customers and navigate regulations. So this makes prior experience less important. So in this case, in terms of RV, FDI is uniformly high. So the low values of FDI are implausible, regardless of a firm's prior international experience, and therefore is only weakly related to it. In countries with weak marketing supporting institutions, firms are left to fend for themselves. So in this case, prior experience is very important. So firms with low levels of experience are likely to have low levels of FDI, but firms with high levels of experience are likely to have higher levels of FDI. So we can see that market supporting institutions interfere with the effects of experience. And this is easily justified using RV terms. All you need to do is, again, explain why FDI is uniformly high when there are strong market supporting institutions, and why FDI varies as a function of experience when these institutions are absent. Illes et al. Provides a good example of RV at the micro level. So they argue that within-person changes in positive affect are associated with an increase in OCBs, but this is moderated by trait agreeableness, such that the relationship is weaker for those high in trait agreeableness. The authors argued that the positive affect is necessary for those who are low in agreeableness to engage in OCBs. Those who are high in agreeableness are going to engage in OCBs regardless of their affect. So although the authors didn't make RV arguments, it's really easy to convert these arguments into RV terms. So OCB has less variance. In other words, it's uniformly high when trait agreeableness is high, in which case OCB has less of a relationship with positive affect. When trait agreeableness is low, OCB has more variance, and this variance is explained by positive affect. Before I get into more of the nuances about RV interactions, I want to kind of clarify a very similar sounding term, but it's entirely different from RV, and that's restriction of range. Range restriction involves truncation of cases. So they describe a situation in which there's direct or indirect selection on one of the variables in the system. So this, again, results in truncation. This is not restricted variance. An RV phenomena does not involve exclusion of cases. Rather, the scores on a variable are compressed in a particular direction as a function of the moderator. Another key difference is that range restriction affects standardized indices, but not unstandardized. So it affects correlations and beta weights. Restricted variance interactions, they affect unstandardized indices, and therefore affect tests for interaction. So even though RV interactions are pretty easy to defend and justify, you have to be careful about where the compression occurs, because it changes the regression coefficients. There's different effects. So compression can be on Y, it can be on X, it can be on both X and Y, or any mediators in your model. So let's talk about the most common form, which is compression on Y. So let's say I'm interested in the relationship between neuroticism and expressions of fear. And I collect data in a situation where there are strong norms against expressing fear, so like an army briefing. And then I collect data in a situation where these norms don't exist. So I don't really expect that the norms of the situation are going to affect neuroticism, because this is a stable individual difference. I do expect that these norms will affect the variance in expressions of fear. So here's the data that I supposedly collected. I generated the strong situation data by multiplying the weak situation values by 0.4. So what you can see is that this transformation reduces large values more than it reduces small values. And this is reflected, this reflects the phenomenon described by Michelle. And we still see that there is a positive relationship between X and Y, but higher values of Y are unlikely in the strong situation because they've been compressed downward. Thus, it has less variance in the strong condition versus the weak condition. So why does this happen? Well, it's because compression on Y affects the covariance between X and Y. So as we compress Y, we reduce the covariance between X and Y. And when you enter this into the equation for the regression weight, we're reducing the numerator. And by reducing the numerator, we suppress B. So you can see this when I plot the data. We see that the regression weights are different between these two conditions, and that the regression weight in the strong situation is much smaller than that of the weak situation. If we took this a step further and combined this into one data file and had a dichotomous moderator representing situation strength, we would find that the product of the interaction is significant and negative. And this is because the XY slope is closer to 0 in the strong condition than in the weak condition. Okay, so compression on X, you might think that, well, any sort of compression is going to affect all the variables in the same way. So it should reduce B. Well, it doesn't. This is kind of a misconception about compression effects. And in X, when there's compression on X, it doesn't only influence the numerator, it also influences the denominator. And more so, it reduces the denominator by the square of the amount that it reduces the numerator. So we're making the denominator even smaller, which actually increases B. So compression on Y, we see smaller B values, but compression on X, we see larger regression weights. So then what happens when we have compression on both X and Y? Well, again, if you didn't know that how compression affects X, it affects it differently than compression on Y, you would think that it would doubly reduce the weights, but it's actually not the case. So in this example, Ozer proposed a mediated moderation model in which OCB, in the first stage, OCBs predict team member exchange, but it's moderated by task autonomy. And as you can see from the quote here, they're suggesting that situational strength compresses both OCB and team member exchange. And they assume that the relationship is doubly reduced by compression on both X and Y. But that actually isn't what happens. What really happens is that compression on X cancels out the effects of compression on Y, and this leaves the XY relationship unaffected. So if the compression effect is similar for these two variables, then the situation shouldn't moderate their relationship. And then this gets a little more complicated when we have mediator compression. So if the moderator restricts variance in the mediator, this has implications for not only the first stage, but also the second stage of the mediation. So Zhang and Bartle, they argue that psychological empowerment mediates the effects of empowering leadership on intrinsic motivation. And they argued that empowerment role identity moderates the relationship between empowering leadership and empowerment. So in general, empowering leadership and empowerment have a positive relationship. But there are those who don't have any interest in being empowered. So for these people, empowering leadership is not likely to lead to empowerment. Well, we can easily take these arguments and put them in RV terms. So this is the RV version of these arguments. So for those low in empowerment role identity, empowerment is uniformly low, meaning it has little variance, regardless of leadership. For those high in empowerment role identity, empowerment varies, and this variation can be explained with empowering leadership. So we might conclude as the result of this first stage RV interaction, the indirect effect of empowering leadership on intrinsic motivation is stronger for those high in empowerment role identity. That's actually not the case. So recall from your early stats classes that a mediation model contains two endogenous variables. So it contains two dependent variables. The mediator is the dependent variable in the first equation, and then it's the IV in the second equation. So if you recall, we've already talked about how compression on Y reduces the weights and compression on X increases the weights. So what we see is, we'll see that compression on the mediator will reduce the weight in the XM equations, in the first equation, but it will increase the weight in the MY equation, the second equation, by the same amount. So the compressing effect of role identity in one relationship is essentially canceled out by its compressing effect in the other, leaving the indirect effect unchanged across levels of the moderator. So again, as I said, these types of interactions are very easy to defend, but where the compression occurs has significant implications for your hypotheses and interpretation of results. There's also some testing considerations for RV effects. So it's basically the same set of steps for any interaction effect. So if you have a categorical moderator, you look at XY relationship at different levels of Z, or in the different groups. If you have a continuous moderator, you'd look at the substantial weight of the partial product. For an RV interaction, you have to take it one step further. You have to demonstrate that the variance of the compressed variable differs across levels of the moderator. So you have to demonstrate the pattern of heteroskedasticity. And a way that you do that is to test for equality of variance. Now there's many different types of tests, and it really depends, and the test that you use really depends on your moderator. So if you have a categorical moderator, you would probably use Bartlett's, Levine's, or Brown-Forsyth. Brown-Forsyth is the more robust of these, but a word of caution, what's labeled Brown-Forsyth in like SPSS and R, I'm not sure about other packages, but for those packages, that's not the test for variance differences. That's actually a test for robust mean differences. So if you want to use that, I recommend you go to Jose's website. He has detailed illustrations for how to actually conduct all of these tests. And then if you have a continuous moderator, you would probably use the Broch-Pagan test as well. And again, I recommend you go to the website to read more about it and learn how to actually conduct these tests. So I hope that you come away from this presentation understanding that kind of adopting this RV mindset really helps to untangle the nature of many interactions, and that it's really easy to justify these types of interactions. But you have to remember that where the compression takes place really makes all the difference, and that there are these additional testing considerations. So you have to take it once. It's not enough just to show that there's an interaction. You have to take it one step further to confirm the RV pattern. And so now I will.
Well, thank you very much, Kate. And we are opening up right away for questions. So please, if you use the chat function to get in your questions for Kate. Taking a minute here, I think, to...
Sorry, I can't actually pull up the chats where it's not showing for some reason.
There are no questions so far, so if you have any questions on restricted variance, please send them in now. Okay, here we got the first one, Kate.
Yes, it can exist. So again, it's a quote unquote normal interaction, but there is this kind of extra element of changes in variance. So it's really just showing that the variance changes as levels of the moderator change.
Mm-hmm. Other recommendations for resources?
Oh, yes. So there's, of course, Cohen and et al.'s book on regression, Barry and Walter. It's a SAGE pamphlet. I can, if you email me, I can send it to you. We have a paper that's in press at JOM as well that goes into a lot of detail about this. Yes, an RV interaction can exist if the moderator is categorical. Gender might be difficult because they have to actually demonstrate this individual difference. There has to be a true individual difference between men and women on this variable, or the tendency to for whatever this outcome is. But yes, it can work with categorical or continuous.
Go. Kate, off the top of your head, could you think of an example of another categorical variable that could illustrate this other than gender?
Another category, it could be like experimental conditions. So if you're in the control group versus treatment group, that would be another, you could classify that as categorical, or you could do it as continuous.
Okay.
Yep, those would work as well.
There would be another example here, political parties.
Yes, if it does actually, if it is truly an individual difference, then yes, it would. That's probably one caveat, is that you have to make sure that there is going to be variability naturally in the outcome based on some sort of underlying difference. So there are some additional caveats, but again, I really recommend the JOM article that came out or is pending to come out, and if you have, I can send you reference.
Okay, we have just a few more minutes. If there are any other questions on restricted variance interactions, certainly give me something to think about here. And I think there are no questions at this moment. I'm sure Kate, I think Kate might be available still a little bit here for any questions that may come in from the chat. And so in the interest of time, we'll move on to our third panelist, Katherine Chen. And as a reminder here, Kate's presentation will also be posted on the Dropbox folder shortly, and she may have also some recommended readings that she can share with us. So now on to our third and last presentation of today, to Katherine Chen, talking about conducting field-level qualitative research. And Katherine, the floor is all yours.
Great, thank you so much. So I might be a little bit of the outlier in this group in terms of the kinds of presentation I'm going to give today. So this presentation is already available in the Dropbox, but I'm going to go ahead and play it for you. So you should be seeing the screen hopefully right now. So just some caveats. I've developed this mostly for novice organizational researchers who are thinking about possible research questions and methods at the field level for organizations. And I do assume some familiarity with organizational theories and research methods. However, do feel free to submit what you think might be simple questions about the methods or the theories during the Q&A. With the presentation, I've put in a lot of references to organizational research that is not necessarily just on for-profit organizations, but also nonprofit and other kinds of organizations. So in the interest of allowing for cross-pollination across fields, I know most of you are coming from the business end. But it's very helpful to read about what's happening in different fields as well. So just a little bit about myself so you understand where I'm coming from. I was trained at Stanford, where neo-institutionalism and organizational ecology were among the contenders for, competing competing theories, and I continued my training at Harvard as a sociologist and not necessarily a person in organizational behavior, for example, or a DBA. My disciplinary training has offered a more critical perspective on both the substantive content and the methodology. My specialty is organizational ethnography, and I tend to study extreme cases. In the Dropbox, you'll find a preprint version of a chapter I've written on using extreme cases. If you're interested in reading more about that, you can access it there. And I've turned to studying organizational fields. And the reason I've turned to studying organizational fields, and I'll define what it is in a minute, is for my own dissertation, which is now out as a book and also several articles. I looked at the organization that coordinates the annual Burning Man event, which some of you may have heard about already. It's an event that happens in the Nevada Black Rock Desert. It attracts about 80,000 people who gather together for a week. It started off as a very informal event, and then because of the coordination issues, assumed a for-profit. They had to organize as a for-profit organization, and now they've actually turned into a non-profit organization, which I don't think is very typical for for-profit organizations, but they felt that was a more appropriate fit for what they were trying to accomplish. And one of the things that came out of the research I was doing was looking at how they manage their relationships with various entities, including the federal, local, and state level government, dealing with the media, which was very eager to kind of portray Burning Man in particular ways, as well as different kinds of organizations or individuals who wanted to essentially expropriate Burning Man's name or imagery to sell their own products or services. And so that part of my research, along with what's happening in organizational theory in general, I've started focusing on the field level. I'm currently writing research on interconnected fields of organizations that serve adults who are aging in place in New York City, and I'm currently starting off an ethnographic research project of a micro school and its larger network that it's helping to generate. And these are what is called self-directed learning centers and affiliates, and they combine democratic practices. In all these projects, I've been an outsider with little prior knowledge of these organizations' activities, so most of my efforts were spent trying to understand what organizations do or how they're enacted, especially in relationship with each other. Many of you may be studying organizations that are a bit more conventional, or maybe not, but oftentimes it helps to be a true outsider as opposed to, some of them you may have access to organizations because you've worked there previously or you have some kind of relationship, but just be aware of some of the trade-offs of that. It might be quicker access, but it may also mean that you might overlook some more subtle or taking for granted phenomenon. Okay, so if you look at organizational theory, particularly in sociology, you'll find that most of the theory has started to move towards understanding field level dynamics. So this is organizations in relationship to other actors. So I've put a bunch of the theories here, which may be familiar to many of you. Probably the last one is maybe the most recent, strategic action fields, which is merging research on social movements literature and more organizational research. So by Flickstein and McAdam, which argues that shared meanings and collective identities are a basis for coordinating collective action towards either reproducing the status quo or introducing change. And this applies to all kinds of organizations, but many of you might be more familiar with the other kinds of theories, like, maybe it's not necessarily a theory, but like a network analysis, for example, looking at interlocking directorates, for example. For the most part, these field level studies, quantitative studies have dominated, and they've shown us, various findings like, the rise and fall of competing populations with organizational forms, or how practices or institutional logics have disseminated across the organizations. And these studies tend to rely on things like directories of organizations, documentation, or surveys. But if you think about this, these kinds of data tend to favor studying more established, i.e. older and more conventional organizations that have survived. So what's missing? So quantitative, some of the criticisms is that quantitative measures tend to be blunt. So for example, if you're using network analysis, you can see that a relationship exists between two entities, but you don't know what's happening in that relationship unless you have access to communicated information. Without qualitative research, it's oftentimes harder to identify and understand the emergence of new fields, organizational forms, practices, or the contentions or struggles that happen. So for example, if you think about the rise in Netflix, like that this, what used to be a rental of CDs, like, competing with Blockbuster, is now producing its own content, for example. It's probably creating, it's enlarging its domain or its field. Same thing with Apple or Google, for example, moving into self-driving cars. Organizations are increasingly assuming more network-like forms, or they have distributed members and practices where people are not located in the same physical location, and they have organizational boundaries that are more porous. So you might see this with platform organizations like Uber, Airbnb, for example, where it's not clear, are hosts actually members of the organizations or not? How does that organization communicate with those members of their organizations? We also have organizations that are connected through either informal commitments or projects. So for example, informal understandings that two organizations or more will cooperate with each other if there's an emergency. So there's a reference here to Chisholm's work on the Bay Area Transit, the cooperation, I think, between 3 different transit authorities in case of emergencies. You also have organizations where members increasingly have limited face-to-face contact. And I think one of the first ethnographies that started to discuss some of these issues, not necessarily at the field level, but it kind of helps you start to understand these kinds of organizations, is Julian Orr's ethnography of, and anyone has struggled with a copier machine has dealt with this issue, copier machine technicians. How is it that they learn to troubleshoot problems with copier machines? Some organizations also coordinate through efforts through umbrellas or meta-organizations. So if you look at NASA's program, they have something called the Launch Program, where they target issues about sustainability, and they invite people from different kinds of organizations to brainstorm and identify problems and identify solutions. And they do it outside the context of conventional organizations. So this is meant to accelerate innovation. So there's a couple different ways that you can understand fields. So essentially fields are composed, depending on the definition that you use, organizations that either recognize each other as belonging to the same field. It could be like an industry. It could be organizations that are serving the same population, for example, or a similar population. And it can include organizations that they may not necessarily recognize as part of their field, but it depends on what kind of definition you're operating with. So there's a couple different ways to capture them. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the ones that are not necessarily covered in the readings that are in the Dropbox. So there's one reading in the Dropbox by Zilber, which covers some of the content I have here. So I'm going to not necessarily cover that as much unless someone has a specific question about it, and cover other items that I think are more interesting, aren't necessarily, I think, widely used in organizational research, but have been successfully used to study organizations within other subdisciplines. Okay. So some issues to tackle. So if you're going to use a field level analysis, one of the issues will be determining where the field boundaries are. So for example, who are the actors that are involved in your field and what are their roles? So again, some of the definitions of fields emphasize actors that are regularly interacting with each other, or at least are aware of each other. Problem with this field level analysis is if you're not if you're focusing on the main players, you may overlook those who are not well integrated in the field and may actually be the most interesting or innovative actors in the field. These people or these organizations may be at the periphery of these fields. And more importantly, you might also get a sense by talking to actors or observing them. So actors can be organizations, right, or these meta-organizations, or some other, could be individuals within an organization as well. What are their understandings of their activities and or misunderstandings of other actors as well? Okay. Fields, the concept of fields is useful because you can look at multiple fields and how they're connected. Strategic action fields, so I use abbreviation SAFs here. That's the Flixting and McAdam reading, relies on a nested doll analogy where fields can nest within fields. So you can study how something in one field impacts another. Typically something like the state comes in with some kind of regulation. What's the implication for other organizations who are trying to struggle to understand what's happening? Also actors, you can also think about, people within the field, right, and organizations may be fuzzy about where the field is bounded, and there may be disagreements or agreements in some cases about who should be included. And these disagreements or these kinds of not being very sure about who is part of the field can become part of your data as well. Okay, so for some of you, right, particularly coming from business schools or business programs, you're probably particularly interested in things like innovation or emergence of fields. So if you're looking for a theory that could particularly help you with this, is using strategic action fields theory that argues that you're probably more likely to find this with peripheral organizations that are more likely to challenge the status quo. I argue that you should be looking at extreme cases, as these are oftentimes organizations that are trying different things that are not accepted or are not conventional, and they may actually try and develop their own fields in order to survive, and that can eventually trickle over to other fields or influence other fields. So you can read more about this in the Dropbox. How do you start to find sites if you want to study organizational fields? Some people will probably start with a micro level, thinking that that's the easiest way to do it. So they'll start an organization that's of interest to them and see what other actors they interact with. So that's how I did it for my original research on Burning Man. And then I looked a little bit at how they disseminated other kinds, so other organizations formed or other projects formed are worldwide, including organizations in Europe, for example. So there will be a symposium in November about that. Some of you may be already familiar with Pilar Opaza's book on El Bulli, the restaurant, which is now closed, but they had a foundation. They developed a notation system in order to basically document their practices and also spread them. So one of the components of their restaurant model was to have people intern in the organizations, and in turn, these people set up their own organizations or took these practices. Maybe they don't necessarily use the same techniques, but the El Bulli method has essentially spread around the world. And so a field level analysis would allow you to sort of capture that. But Pilar starts with kind of a more conventional ethnography, starting with one organization. The next slide is about what I call chimeric organizations that are kind of pieces of different organizations. So you can look at incubator organizations that are trying to generate other kinds of organizations. You could also look at umbrella or meta organizations, which are composed of representatives of other organizations. Oftentimes, some people say that this is an easier way to do efforts than trying to do something just within their own organization. Or you can look at attempted collaborations. So I've given 2 examples here that are not necessarily from the for-profit sector, but might be helpful. Some people train as a professional in order to gain access to a field. So if probably most of you are familiar with the second reading here, which is Brooke Harrington's study of wealth managers, where she actually went through the course of studying being a wealth manager, and that helped her gain access to understanding a field which is pretty much cloaked in secrecy, right? Minus some leaks of like the Paradise Papers. Now, this is the part that I think is more novel and might be useful for some of you who are able to, for example, videotape things or gain access to documents. So you could use an elicitation technique, and this would help you understand the assumptions and understandings that an organization might have about itself and its relationship to other kinds of actors. And the reference I have here, some of you who are parents might actually find this interesting in itself as a comparison of educational models. The preschools in 3 cultures revisited. What the researchers there did is they filmed activities at preschools in 3 different countries, 2 sites in each country, and then they condensed it down to 20 minutes, and they had the teachers narrate what it is they were doing or why they were doing it as well. And then those videos became the basis for a discussion, a focus group discussion with other people who would watch the video and then collectively discuss what they saw. And this was very helpful for uncovering what people might otherwise take for granted as their own practices, and would also elicit, some kind of response from those watching. So you may want to think you could possibly use this technique yourself if you're trying to get responses from other organizations about what they think about other organizational practices, for example, or organizational efforts. I put the link here. If you have access to Canopy, you can actually watch their version of the documentary and also look at their associated book. This next slide is also somewhat unusual. This is for more difficult to study kind of groups, and it's also meant more if you're interested in like actually doing more kind of participatory action research. So this is something that's just not impressed yet, but I just recently read a draft about it where it's called peer reciprocal interviewing, where the interviewees and interviewee are actually both respondents. The researcher is just providing support, but these, one of the issues is that oftentimes researchers find it difficult to design a meaningful interview protocol. And so one of the ways that this could be done is if participants are interested in doing this, is actually co-constructing the interview and applying it and interviewing each other, possibly. Of course, you may want to think what are some of the trade-offs of that as well. And then there's some standard recommendation that the Zilber article goes over, which is how to access more of the field level. So going to events like conferences, trade shows, or conventions, trainings, or professional development or competitions. These are sometimes called field configuring events, going to public spaces or virtual spaces. And here you can start to document who's attending, who's represented, who's not represented, and more importantly in some cases. And these probably tend to be more peripheral actors. Another important thing to think about is refusals and silences are part of the data. So if you want to study an organization or you try to go ask for an interview, what's not being talked about, or why might, why are organizations refusing to talk to you? Or conversely, why are they talking to you? Is it there's something that they want to get out? Particularly if they want to grow their network, they might be more interested in talking to a researcher than not talking to a researcher. And that in itself can be a piece of data that could be pretty telling. Okay. The final slide that I'll cover, I think this is almost my final slide, is if you're doing ethnographic research, most likely you're going to make a lot of mistakes along the way. And these are oftentimes opportunities for etymological experiments. Now, the researcher I have here, he's actually an urban sociologist. He was studying homelessness in Skid Row down in Los Angeles, but he has a chapter that talks about police interactions with the homeless, and as well as their connections with the different social service agencies. And those chapters in themselves, I think, are pretty helpful, as well as his attempts to kind of break into these populations and talk to very difficult to reach populations. Okay, so I've put a couple more slides here about some of the considerations when you're entering the field and starting to research the field, is that actors may seek some kind of quid pro quo kind of exchanges. So they might ask, for example, a partnership with your organization, or they may ask for information collected that you've collected from your interviews or your informants to understand what's happening in the field. That happened with the El Bulli study with OPASA. So you'll have to make a decision about what is public knowledge, what can be shared, especially regarding confidentiality. Because once you get known as someone who becomes an expert on the field, people will probably start asking you questions as well. So, and that in itself is actually part of the data. Okay, so here at the very last, I've just kind of given one example of writing up research. This again is more coming out of the nonprofit or community-based organizations field, but that's one of the difficulties is writing up this research because you're talking about multiple actors. That can be more difficult than your conventional kind of, focusing on one organization. Okay, so I'm going to, let's see, yeah. And I do have a couple more slides here. So the Zilber reading is in the Dropbox. This Emily Barman article, again, is more about the nonprofit sector, but it covers the most recent variants of field theory. So those summaries in themselves, if you're interested in reading them, would be useful, even if you're not interested specifically in the nonprofit sector. Okay, so I think I'm ready for questions. I know I kind of stopped at full speed, so let me get out of here and see if I can now take questions. Okay.
Great, thank you very much. Katherine. And again, to everybody, just send in your questions through the group chat function. Okay, until the questions come in here, I just have one question, or perhaps a comment, what I found interesting, and perhaps as a contrast to the presentation just before you, is, you spoke of the micro level as individual organizations, and certainly just the panelists before you, a micromanagement researcher, would have a very different perspective on what micro is, and so I think that's always interesting to hear this contrast of what is micro versus macro for different researchers who study different.
I mean, so like even so for strategic action fields theory, for example, that the field can even be within the organization, so it could be different departments, for example, interacting with each other. So yeah, I mean, I still think about micro as between being amongst people as well.
Okay, we do have questions here now for you. So the first one perhaps here, difference between SAF and social network theory.
Okay, so I guess some of the criticism about, I'm not sure specifically, so AMR has asked the question, what is the difference between strategic action fields and social network theory? Some people criticize, I don't know if you're talking about social network theory as sort of like social network analysis, right? Some of the criticism has been a bit atheoretical, and strategic action fields is less about looking at ties, measuring ties, if I'm interpreting this question carefully, according to how it's been posed, and more about offering a bunch of kind of propositions about what you would expect to see situations when organizations are more likely to kind of reproduce the status quo versus an organization being able to, for example, disseminate some kind of innovation or becoming the kind of dominant player in the field.
So the next question, perhaps you could answer very concisely, because there's a lot that could be said about that, I'm sure.
When is it appropriate to address a research question via qualitative methods, and at what level of development of the theory, right? Yes, so some people might actually want to do both, right? So you can imagine someone who might then decide that they have enough, for example, money and resources and time to kind of construct something that could be measured more quantitatively. So I think it really depends on the kind of research question, right? So if you're asking about the nitty gritty about certain things, you might have to rely on more qualitative methods to kind of get at that, and may use the quantitative methods to allow for kind of a more broad strokes, right? And at what level of development of theory, right? Yeah, so I think one of the references I had in my presentation was about abductive theory. So we have deductive theory, for example, using a theory to kind of test some hypotheses. And the readings I have referenced in the presentation talk about more how do you actually develop theory using the qualitative, like testing ideas in the field. Okay, so we have a couple more here. Okay, how do you see the complexity theory being relevant in social movement studies? Not sure I would know enough to be able to comment on that. It's a complexity theory, so I would have to get back to you on that. Maybe the person can clarify or give a URL.
Maybe we can move on to the next question.
Yeah. Would you have any suggestions for strategic management scholars who study social movements and collective actions targeting at firms? Okay, so suggestions. Oh, okay. So for particular persons, like who have done research like that, or do you mean like?
Yeah, I think the way I would interpret the question is any references or
right. Okay, so Braden, yeah, so Braden King at Northwestern School, Kellogg School of Management, has been big on this. So he's got a bunch of articles and like edited volumes out on this. But it's usually not necessarily targeted at firms. Like, I guess, there's shareholder activism, things like that. I guess this, I'm not sure if it's like, for example, getting firms to do something different. I would start with Braden King,
So,
and there's probably some others as well.
so I would say if Xinran has a kind of a follow-up question that can be a little bit more targeted, she can just submit it once more, and otherwise we can move on to the next question. A little bit more about your project.
All right, so I just typed Braden's name in so you can get the correct spellings. So Tomi, okay, can you tell a little bit more about your current project and how you have chosen the actors and organizations you observed so far? Okay, so my current research project is on micro schools, and specifically these are schools that are very small, like maybe there are like 30 students with like a few teachers. They're typically private schools. They're schools are established because people are not happy with the conventional educational system. And they've been around for a while, though, you know, back in the 60s, 70s, they had a lot more difficult time operating because you couldn't necessarily get permission from the state, and I mean by local state, to educate your child in non-public school settings that weren't necessarily recognized private schools. So now I think, you know, the cat is out of the bag. And what I did is I found an organization that actually there's not many of these democratic organizations that are still existing. It's an organization that's rebooted, and I approached them and another organization. And sometimes it's a matter of access, who's willing to say yes and who's willing to say no. And the organizations that said yes, that in itself, compared to the organizations that said no, was telling, because this organization is really trying to grow through the network model, whereas the other one, I don't think it's adopting that same strategy. So they actually have like an open source kit where people can download how to start an own organization. They're constantly hosting visits from other organizations or other interested individuals. So I, you know, was pretty lucky to get access, you know, to a place. For many of you, maybe the practical thing of, you know, who's willing to say yes to you, right? And that, you know, that does shape your research question to some degree, right? Your interpretation of the results. Okay.
If you could respond to the question on how you suggest handling change or shift in boundaries during the course of data collection.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the part of the field emergence, right? So I think field boundaries are never fully fixed, right? We're always shocked when, you know, like, I don't know how many people predicted like Bear Stearns, for example, would blow up, for example, right? I mean, things are always in flux. It's just sometimes we don't always recognize it. I think people are also very surprised when Acorn shut down, for example, another kind of organization that's been around for quite some time. So I think, you know, in terms of handling the part of the data, right? Yeah, it's you know, means you have to keep more track of the actors, but it also gives you an understanding of what's happening in the field over time, right? So, you know, it would probably allow you to start understanding how dynamic these fields can be, right? So